Welcome, nutritionradio.org listeners. This is Lonnie Lowry, University Nutrition Professor of over 20 years and podcast host of long-running shows like Iron Radio. Come on in. Fitness Fridays. Hey everybody, what time of day do you exercise? I'm asking because my old approach when I was competing in bodybuilding was that I would get up early, get a cup of black coffee, and then within an hour or so I'd get on the treadmill and walk uphill and do some cardio, if you will. It's not really cardiovascular hard training. And then I would do some weights later in the day when I was going for performance. I can't say I was a morning person because I really had to force myself to get up and walk uphill on that treadmill. But also, I don't think I'm an evening person either. I never liked to do, for example, martial arts training with my school between 7 and 9 p.m. It felt too late. I kind of like the midday thing, but that brings us to this concept of chronotype. Again, the morning lark versus the night owl. People vary quite a bit. Mice, not so much, but that's what we're going to talk about today. At least they can be looked at in a very controlled way. There's a new paper that came out. It was February 13th, 2023, when I first saw it. Time of day may determine the amount of fat burned by exercise. Now, what I'm going to do is share just a high-level cursory view of that, and then go take a look at a very similarly titled news report from 2019, which was called Does Time of Day Affect Body's Response to Exercise? If you weren't very careful in what you were looking at, what tissue, for example, or what aspect of exercise was considered quote-unquote good, you could walk away from this very confused. And honestly, I think even after this 2023 paper, and looking back to these, actually a couple of papers in 2019, I'm just sort of defaulting to this concept that it's probably better to try to train when your body likes it most. But let's take a look at the science here. This first one, 2023 paper from the Karolinska Institute in Sweden, was published in the journal PNAS, Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences. Here's the synopsis. Physical activity at the right time of day seems able to increase fat metabolism, at least in mice. And this is where it's always interesting to look at methodology, even at a high level here. Mice are nocturnal. They're not like people. They don't, at least most people, they don't neatly sleep between 6 and, let's say, 8 hours when it's dark outside. So what they have to do is actually try to correspond the mouse's light-dark cycle with a more typical human light-dark cycle, which is kind of the opposite. The synopsis says, mice that did exercise in an early active phase, quote-unquote, active phase, which corresponds to morning exercise in humans, increased their metabolism more than mice that did exercise at a time when they usually rest. They reached this conclusion by looking at fat tissue. It says researchers studied adipose tissue of mice after a session of high-intensity exercise performed at 2 points of the daily cycle. They studied various markers for fat metabolism and analyzed which genes were active in adipose tissue after exercise. They found that physical activity at an early active phase increased the expression of genes involved in the breakdown of adipose tissue, also thermogenesis, right, heat production, and then mitochondria, the little energy furnaces, if you will, powerhouses within the adipose tissue. And these effects were independent of food intake. It's very interesting. According to Professor Julene Zirath, our results suggest that late morning exercise could be more effective than late evening exercise in terms of boosting metabolism and burning of fat. Again, sort of extrapolating to people, saying it could prove of value to people who are overweight. So there are some conclusions from the most recent paper, again, the 2023 paper, and they really relied on adipose tissue to make their conclusions. Now let's look at this 2019 report from the journal Cell Metabolism. There's actually 2 studies in here. And again, the science news title, the reporter's title is, Does Time of Day Affect the Body's Response to Exercise? It sounds a lot like the 2023 one. That did admittedly talk about the amount of fat burned by exercise. But instead of focusing on fatty tissue, adipose tissue, these papers base their conclusions on muscle tissue. Now, admittedly, in that first paper, when it talked about the amount of mitochondria in fat tissue, I can see how that plays a role in fat burning, but let's face it, when you're exercising, fat burning, a lot of that takes place in muscle and contracting muscle, where the muscle mitochondria await to take up some fatty acids and then burn them in a process called beta oxidation. Now, we have two senior researchers here. One is Gad Asher from the Weizmann Institute of Science, and he has some cool quotes to offer. And we also have Pablo Sassone Corsi of UC Irvine, University of California, Irvine. Let's start with Gad Asher's group and a quote from them. It's quite well known that almost every aspect of our physiology and metabolism is dictated by the circadian clock. This is true not only in humans, but in every organism that is sensitive to light. We decided to ask whether there is a connection between the time of day and exercise performance. The reporting here from Science Daily says Asher's group started by putting the mice in treadmills at different times of the day within their quote-unquote active phase, and they looked at their exercise capacity with different exercise intensities and regimens. Overall, they found exercise performance was substantially, like 50% better in some protocols, in the mouse evening, again, toward the end of their active time compared to the morning hours. Now, on its surface, this looks like it contradicts that 2023 paper we started with that was more about fat burning. But remember, this is about performance. By focusing on muscle tissue like they did in some of the muscle biochemistry, if you will, they found higher levels of a metabolite called ZMP. It's known to activate metabolic pathways like glycolysis, right, which breaks down glucose or carbohydrate, and then fatty acid oxidation as well. Therefore, it is likely to contribute to the increased exercise capacity in the evening, they said. Now, curiously, the researchers also looked at 12 humans and found similar effects. So overall, they reported that people in the study had lower oxygen consumption while exercising compared to in the morning, in the evening compared to the morning. And they interpreted that as better exercise efficiency, less oxygen consumption for the work they were performing. And there's one other paper that's reported here from that Paolo Sassone Corsi and colleagues. Here's a quote from them: "Circadian rhythms dominate everything we do. Previous studies from our lab have suggested that at least 50% of our metabolism is circadian, and 50% of the metabolites in our body oscillate based on the circadian cycle. It makes sense that exercise would be one of the things that are impacted." So what did they do? They also put mice on treadmills. They also looked at muscle tissue responses to exercise. And they found a protein called hypoxia-inducible factor 1 alpha. That's a mouthful. Plays an important role in that it's activated by exercise in different ways depending on the time of day. They say the protein is known to stimulate certain genes based on oxygen levels in muscle tissue. This is a little bit more of a indirect, maybe not a reach, but a little more indirect for me. And it says, based on work from this UC Irvine team, exercise seemed to have the most beneficial impact on metabolism. Again, this is using muscle tissue and looking at some of these particular muscle proteins at the beginning of the active phase. That is equivalent to late morning in humans compared with the resting evening phase. So this is a little more in line with the 2023 paper that we started with. That is, it seemed to like this concept of improved metabolism when exercise is done earlier in your active cycle. But you can see we have to be very careful. Are we looking at fat burning? Are we looking at performance? In a way, I feel like it's justifying, and maybe this is just my bias, the old bodybuilder approach, which is get your butt out of bed fairly early, turn on some of those genes, get in some exercise, particularly exercise that burns fat. And then if you want performance, maybe that's a little bit later in the day. Of course, Sassone Corsi's group says that translating the findings to humans is not so straightforward. One reason is that humans have more variation in their chronotypes than mice living in a lab. You may be a morning person, you may be a night person, and those have to be taken into account. Overall, this little update, again, of just studies that have come across my desk, suggests to me that I need to start doing some bonus episodes that are a little bit longer, interview, in this case, someone who has specialty in chronobiology, see what they have to say about the totality of the literature to see if there's anything that can be applied from just the science news, quote-unquote news, like we often cover. But we're out of time, so thanks for tuning in. You can find the backup on YouTube. It doesn't get a lot of attention, but you can find it at Lawnman07 on YouTube. You can also check us out on Spotify and iTunes. We're on where most podcasts are found. And please like, subscribe, do whatever you can in these different places. It really helps on iTunes. And we'll see you next time. The NutritionRadio.org podcast is for informational purposes only. If you're interested in starting a diet or exercise program, check with your physician, nutritionist, or qualified exercise physiologist in order to make the progress that you need.